Oh, it's here you are, performance artist. In fact, quite a well-known performance artist. Would you like to tell me just how you got here?
Yeah. Well, a lot of turning points, a lot of major turning points that occur, I think, start quite early. Well, I think it started earlier for me. In high school, I had two large infatuations between wanting to be a dancer and also I was very interested in theater. What interested me about theater particularly were the things that were within the realm of control, within the realm of influence for how the experience of a performance became constructed. And these are the things that didn't just pertain to a performer, but how these other variables support a performer and how they facilitate a connection between performer and audience. With dance, what I loved about it is that when you are the performer, there's a level of autonomy that you have, and I have to make the distinction between autonomy, which is something I continue to revisit, or I try to revisit in my work, versus power. And what power is the influence over something, the control over something. But autonomy is the independence from control. So at the time I didn't know that performance and the ability to control a performance could really intersect into an art form, into something that you could consider to be an art form. But at the time I was figuring out a big decision for how I would choose which direction to go and how that would influence the trajectory of my life. It's a big decision to consider, especially when you're conflating the expectations for yourself and the expectations of your parents and your peers. What the right thing is to do, what the safe thing is to do, and what would be the smart thing to do. But I was accepted into art school, among other things. I was accepted into art school and I was accepted into theater production school rather. What made me, at the very last minute, actually one could consider 2 minutes too late, but somehow it worked out. What made me make the decision 2 minutes after the official deadline to make this decision was influenced by the knowledge that heading into art school would be a further pursuit of autonomy, and an autonomy over myself and over my ideas, versus if I were to be involved in a theater production program, there's a community of people, but then what I considered that community to be would be an obstruction of how I would get my idea to the forefront. And say if it were to be put to the forefront, would I have authorship or would I have ownership over that idea? For me, to be an artist or to pursue the beginning stages of becoming an artist felt like it would be it would feel like a more confident path in having an ability to execute my ideas, not compromise them, and own them.
Okay, so in a sense we're leading towards another question, which is, given this question of autonomy and power and such, of course one has to ask the question, what can an artist do within these structures? What does an artist do? And I have a certain quote from you, which is that something crucial about the state of being an artist is a tendency to resist. I wonder if you could just expand on that or explore around it.
Well, what an artist, I think, can't do and shouldn't do is provide a guarantee or provide a certainty for how things will play out. I can't even I can't even guarantee that after this interview I'll be able to make another installation. I want to, but there's no guarantee of that. There's a desire, but I think when you consider this idea of control, there are a lot of things that you think as an artist you could probably have control over to a certain extent. There's the control of how materials come together, how materials and ideas converse, and then how a viewer enters into that conversation between material and idea and even context. The thing about it is, if you set yourself up for predicting or trying to control all of these variables that are influential or influenced by you to a certain degree, then your pursuit isn't coming from a position of curiosity. I think it's coming from a position of ego. And that, I think, ties into another conversation around the pursuit of originality. Whatever originality is to you, or whatever you think you want to be the first, how you want to be the first to do something that's kind of absurd to a certain degree. But ideas and materials are things that, again, you can do your best to put out into the world in some way or another. But the moment you try and control something, then what's even the point of having someone come and see it and expand upon that conversation? I think considering control and considering autonomy, an artist has an idea, expands upon that idea, but allows there to be a relinquishing of control for how someone enters into that idea, how someone sees themselves or projects themselves or intertwines with that idea. It's not, for me, for what I do, I don't want people to feel segregated from that idea or that experience.
Do you see this word relinquishing as leading to or operating around the notion of resistance? If a tendency of an artist, a crucial tendency of an artist is to resist, is relinquishing control, as it were, a part of resistance?
I think so, because there are things that are both internal and external to ourselves that we have to understand how to resist, and that we have to understand that it's okay to resist as well. And relinquishing doesn't just overlap with the idea of resistance, it's also a release as well. A release of sorts that I think takes a bit of a burden off of you in understanding how you can still be the author of an idea, but still understand that that idea can be consumed and can be expanded upon in other ways as well, while not compromising who you are as an artist. This is just sort of, I think, a chemistry in many ways, and how your work and how your idea operates is a catalyst for this kind of chemistry.
Okay, I'm curious about your comments on a couple of statements that have been made about your work. Okay, and one, I'm going to read you two quotations and maybe we can operate off those. One is, quote unquote, she has developed a practice, she being of course yourself, she has developed a practice where the objects and circumstances she creates manifest as burdensome or purgatorial experiences. That's talking about you. And in your own words, my work is informed by my curiosity with control, I'm interested in how people encounter it and where the threshold exists between how someone yields to it and how someone resists it. Bring those two quotations together, maybe a trick, and I'll leave that trick to you. But I would say that if part of your practice, or a central part of your practice, is the developing of a sense of where objects and circumstances manifest as burdensome or purgatorial, perhaps we're getting someplace. Do you want to just comment on those quotations? But more openly, just to talk about what you see as core to your work.
Well, I think what my work is, what I consider it to be, is an exaggeration of many things, many tensions and anxieties that I feel as a person who's just being a person on a day-to-day basis. What my sculptures facilitate as both objects and environments, what they set up are a whole other system of new parameters that are occupied, and when one, usually myself, occupies that, there are boundaries, particular kind of physical limitations that I have to sort of abide by, and also when I abide by them, I simultaneously resist them. I think this sensation of understanding and acknowledging that boundaries and limitations exist, I think that is far more subtle on a day-to-day basis. I think parameters that are inherent within how we live affect us consciously and subconsciously in physical ways, psychological ways, professional ways, social ways. So what my work tries to do is visualize a different kind of system, a different kind of parameter that demonstrates and sometimes exaggerates and sometimes exhausts this tension that has to be worked out and worked through while being a part of it, and being both a part of and apart from it, being submissive and subservient to it while in a way fighting back. One work that certainly comes to mind was my piece Head Study. What's interesting about a work like that, along with a lot of other patterns, along with this similar kind of trend that occurs time and time again in my work, is that there is an object or a structure, and it couldn't come to be into the world unless I permitted it to be. And yet, despite the fact that I'm the creator of this thing, I am submitting myself to it willingly as well. So that positions me as a figure that is both compromised, but also confident in my ability to compromise myself. And between compromise and confidence, there's this duality between those two words. So what happens when you find middle ground between these two things, these two ideas, and how do people react when they encounter someone who's both willing and willing to struggle? What I find kind of funny is that my work that I produce gives a viewer a glimpse of something that I feel within me in ways that just feels commonplace to other people. The difference between the day-to-day and an artwork of mine is that I'm no longer wearing that mask that disguises this tension.
I want to come to another work if I may, that corridor. And thinking about what you were just saying, it strikes me that if I'm walking down a corridor is a place off which doors lead to rooms and such. The corridor is a blind, as it were. It's a passage that goes nowhere except through those doors. And if I'm faced with a door, I have to knock on it. I have to be cautious about what's going to happen, so I want to be careful. So I'm knocking on that door, wondering what the effect is going to be, what I'm going to enter into. In a sense, I'm in an uncertain place. And your corridor, which of course was a raft, as it were, in the harbor, caught between, I'd say, utopia on one side and a former utopia, now dystopia, on the other side. Thinking of the city and the thought of how a city could be, going back to the 1960s. I found that sense that I got from corridor, this uncertainty, because it's a raft, it's floating on the water, and you're pushing against another person, pushing back to you in this very extravagant, in a sense, extrapolation of what a corridor might represent. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, initially the title corridor came from the idea that instead of there being a single wall dividing myself and the other performer, who happened to be my brother, we would be engaging.
Interesting in itself, by the way.
It's a kind of doubling, but a doubling that feels more connected on a biological level. The initial plan for it was that we would in fact be making direct contact between each other. There'd still be that fluctuation and that equilibrium between our presence and our back and forthness, but we would be framed between two walls instead of there being a single wall dividing us. The thing that I thought was interesting about the idea of a corridor is that it's a transitional space that connects one space to another. And instead, in this new work, there were two spaces that felt equally as transitional, equally as uncertain of themselves, and a single wall both dividing these spaces and still remaining to connect these two spaces. What I like about equilibrium, and this is something that this is a pattern that I've noticed in a lot of the work I do leading up to this piece. What I find fascinating about the suspension of equilibrium is that I think as someone who's watching what's happening, you're waiting and waiting and waiting until that equilibrium finds a way of rupturing. So whenever there's the idea or the visualization of balance put forth, there's, I think, an underscoring tension of that balance, losing balance. And I'm always interested in pushing how and where and if that happens at all. If one of us was not present in that performance, would there feel like something? Would it feel like there's something absent altogether? Would it feel like there's a piece missing? What I found interesting formally about that work is that, like the wall dividing myself and my brother, the river divided, as you mentioned before, two versions of Toronto. So this boundary was not only a boundary, but also a paradox in how it divides and how it conjoins things together. And then the structure itself operates as an object, a fragment of architecture, and a platform for people to occupy as well, in an area that feels absurd for anyone to want to occupy.
I want to go back to your decisions around the practices that you are developing. And I'm kind of curious to what extent the practices of other artists, performing artists, installation artists, whoever they might be, the extent to which these former practices or practices that work around your current practice, how they feed into your own.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to make a work that genuinely entices my curiosity, and then when it's made, there is somehow a point of connection between someone I don't even know and someone and myself. I think one ought to be aware of the fact that as much as we consider ourselves to be individuals, we're always going to be, in some ways, overtly a part of the collective consciousness, or if not overtly, then we echo it. And I feel like what I do in some way or another echoes my predecessors, and perhaps will in some way, consciously or not, influence my or my colleagues of the future.
So you bear your sense of art history within your own practice?
I think so. Yeah. It's very interesting to be a woman and be a woman who works with her body in an art form that I think if you were to hear the phrase performance art, you would assume that it's dominated by women. In fact, the majority of works that I've made thus far have been clothed, but when I tell people that I'm working on a new project, one of the very first questions they ask is if I'm going to be naked or not. So, to a degree, it's very important to know what's come before you and what's happening currently, because the past and the present are never not going to be in conversation with each other. But I don't know. I find it sort of perturbing that in the pursuit of this practice that I am continuing to be interested in and surprised by, I'm still in some way or another pigeonholed within this trope of what performance is and what performance art is and who it's occupied by and what one assumes of that person who is involved in that kind of work. There was thinking about sacrifices. I don't think I've made too many. In fact, the largest sacrifice I think I have to make is someone else's comfort when I tell them that I'm a performance artist. Not just an artist, but a performance artist. Because when you start off in a conversation by describing yourself as an artist, it's funny how people react. It feels familiar to how I've received reactions as a child in many ways. But they try and meet you in the middle a little bit. From what I've experienced, they try and think, okay, well, at least that's amazing that you're making money from selling work. And then you just take it a step further by saying, oh no, I am doing work that isn't considered to be conventionally sellable. And then it's interesting how people become more uncomfortable about that than you already are. And I think that's an interesting real life circumstance that dovetails with the work that I already do, which makes a lot of people uncomfortable through encountering.
Um, Discomfort. Perhaps one source of discomfort for many people is the attempt to grapple with and often the failure to be able to grapple with just what's going on in the arts today, contemporary art. What is contemporary art? There's books on it. What is contemporary art? I'm kind of curious if you have any sense of how one would answer the question, well, what is contemporary art today? What kind of context does it seek to construct?
Well, what's interesting is I think when people I think people who aren't familiar with what is described as contemporary art feel this sense of alienation from it. And they like to think that artists, by and large, seem to be in on the conversation or in on the joke. But I think it's also comforting to hear when well, at least when you can find common ground with someone who also just feels alienated or doesn't feel like they have a point of entry into this world that they think you already do by virtue of being an artist. And what I mean by that is that sometimes I feel just as comfortable by saying there's only so much I know. I mean, there's a lot to know. And there's only so much I know about Toronto, and I've lived here my whole life. So I don't think anyone can really know the full answer. In order to have a sense of an answer, you must be aware of the fact that there are many answers, and that there are many overlapping interpretations, and that yours can't possibly really be absolute. The only thing I feel confident in is that contemporary is now, and anyone who's living can contribute to now. So if you're going to contribute, how do you further what is already now? How do you further or expand upon what is already now?
Obviously, you must try to deal with that when you make a production. It is a contribution to now. Do you think about how you would answer the question, how does this work contribute to contemporary discussion? Is there something core to the work that you feel offers something to that?
I think it's interesting that with every work that I make, I'm in some way or another revealing my uncertainty with the world. Whether people are aware of that or not. It might be done confidently, it might be done with full intention, but there is an underlying base of just true uncertainty. And I think I have a suspicion I'm not the only person who is uncertain. So where the discussion may occur is when I acknowledge that I'm uncertain and people feel comfortable as well in acknowledging their own uncertainty, then we can find common ground on how completely lost we all are.
Okay, sometimes lost in theory. And there are so many theoretical texts, so many different positions that are taken that, and of course the question that is posed, what's going on in contemporary art, begs some kind of theoretical answer, the kind of all-embracing answer. And I love the fact that you essentially described it as a situation of uncertainty. I think that resonates.
That's the only thing I really am certain about.
Does theory play a part in your thinking about this question?
About the theory's contribution to process?
Your process.
That's the question before change.
I was, I can begin with describing an experience I had about guest critiquing a group of students once. There was a student that put forward an installation, 2 videos, and to the common eye, everything felt intentional, everything felt thoughtful. But when the student ascended to the role of needing to describe or point out or understand where it was that she was coming from, she, in a way, both honestly and in a way both sort of facilitated a sort of shortcoming of hers, revealed that she had no idea why this came to be. She couldn't put it in words. So that's an interesting challenge for someone who is critiquing your work to riff off of that. So the instructor who was involved in the room with me responded to this by saying, well, a lot of what we do as artists is to follow a process of intuition and reflection. This was said by Simone Jones. And to me, that description was perfect in so many ways, because intuition is the combination of emotion and intellect. Not necessarily in equal parts, but it is a combination of reconciling these two things. And then where I think theory enters into this, this mandate is in the reflection part, mostly. I mean, the more work that you produce, the more theory you're going to accumulate. So that, or you might not even accumulate. I'm coming from an experience where theory has been accumulated over time. So in this process of reflection, theory can serve a purpose. And in some cases, it doesn't really need to. But it is knowledge that can echo or help assist to understand and even connect, will help assist in understanding why you do what you do without telling you the answer, and connect you to a broader conversation of other artists. That is, I think, where theory lies within reflection.
There's something curiously comedic, I find, about your work. At least that's my experience. For yourself, does comedy or a sense of humor seem part of the practice?
I think I couldn't do what I do to the ability that I do it without a sense of humor, period. Mm-hmm. I think humor and absurdity overlap so in such a way where they're so interconnected. And absurdity overlaps into various other realms of thinking and experiencing as well. But certainly absurdity can be rooted in comedy. Art and comedy as well are forms of resistance. And I think to be an artist or to be a comedian is to have the ability to recognize, reveal, and exaggerate the beauty and the absurdity of existence. So that's very important, because I think what comedy and art do is when they overlap or when they don't, and I'm very curious about thinking about the times when they don't, but between those two things, they're massively important for allowing both the facilitator of the experience, whether it's comedic or artistic, and the receiver to shift out of, I think, a manner of complacency, a manner of getting used to seeing the world in one way without having accents of it exaggerated or inflated, in a way that ruptures that way of seeing, in a way that offsets things to make you think, whoa, maybe I should rethink that other side, that other side of things. And it's also important for comedy and art to not necessarily please you, or even worse, exaggerate complacency. I think when done right, not right, when done well, effectively, art and comedy are two platforms that can split apart a room, let's say. And this is important for people to be, I guess, excited or even pissed off, because when there's a spectrum of responses that is facilitated through what you do as a creative practitioner of any sort, is that this becomes the breeding ground for discourse.
I remember you saying something interesting in this light. I'm intrigued by the dichotomy between art and comedy that you just laid out, which I think is actually quite a fruitful dichotomy, provided that we remember something else that you said, which is that the beauty about paradox is it provides a third way. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's a paradoxical relationship between art and comedy in your mind.
Perhaps people associate comedy with language, verbal communication, and art as another form of language. But certainly, when you're using visual language, that doesn't limit text, that doesn't limit spoken word, that doesn't limit itself from becoming something poetic in how it crosses over. But I think indeed, in how art and comedy can be perceived as two antithetical ideas, they also parallel each other in many different ways as well, which again, in and of itself, I think can be considered a paradox.
Mm-hmm. And you work within the arena of paradox.
I'd like to think that I do, without making that the priority of what I do.
Mm-hmm. One can perhaps draw a connection between paradox and uncertainty. And you were talking earlier about how the status of being an artist, for you at least, and perhaps the state of contemporary art, is a state of uncertainty. Mm-hmm.
And coming back to that idea of resistance, to embark upon a life of being an artist is, in and of itself, a rejection of the conventions and models of how one works, how one lives, how one survives. That would be an answer I'd give to someone if they were to ask me, what is the model of survival? I think with any artist or any smart business person or any entrepreneur, all of how people succeed in these arenas of different professions is in their, what I believe, their ability to access resources. Now, resources can come to an artist materially in how they compose these materials together in conjunction with the idea, how the material becomes the vessel for the idea. But if you want to take it a step further, and if you want to continue, in my opinion, if you want to continue to do what you do, while understanding how this relationship between yourself and your work operates, you need to understand that you need to be resourceful beyond this endeavor. And how those resources come to you, whether you sell work or get a grant, whether you converse or are simply present. Those ways, I'd like to believe, are more infinite than what we expect them to be.
What about the role of the curator? As a performance artist, I'm presuming that you don't necessarily see yourself as a studio artist, but rather more as one who works probably with a curator, or at least in the public arena. So back to the question of the curator, do you have what are your feelings about working with curators, or to what extent does a curator function in your practice?
I think in certain cases, curators have presented themselves to me prior to ideas. And then there's a whole, what curators have allowed me to become aware of is the timing of how things operate, and the timing of how things come to be. When you're working with a curator, at least when I've been working with a curator, as I have before more than once, there is the need to be aware of what their expectation is, and what your expectation is. A lot of the time, curator, what makes the experience excellent for me is that they provide a space or a context that then becomes a thing that influences and guides my work into a direction that was different to what my idea initially describes to me. So the curator and their role in getting an idea, taking an idea that is your own and bringing it to manifestation, is that they can provide obstacles, they can provide limitations, but they can provide surprises too, for how you figure out how to work with them and vice versa.
Turning to the question of the critic, of course the critic looms very large in any art practice. Is there a particular critical response or a way that critics respond to your work that you find most useful?
I'm at the stage right now where I find value in anybody who decides to position themselves as a critic, go out of their way to put their opinions of my work in writing. I haven't been put off by too much. I haven't been put off by the methods of how certain critics have done this thus far. But there's also, a critic can do a couple of things. They can work to your benefit in how they describe your work or how they respond to your work. And they can also accidentally and sometimes inadvertently undermine the work and how it's described through the absence of certain details and nuances that you see to be significant. That being said, how I regard a critic, at least at this point in time, is someone who's willing to do more work for me to promote myself. And what I've realized about that is promotion feels far more credible when it's coming from someone else instead of yourself.
Any press is good news.
So far, it's been not bad. Any press provides an artist ubiquity, more ubiquity. I have yet to be insulted by anything that I have discovered to be written about me. That's not saying that it can't happen. It certainly could. But right now, that is where I sort of stand on the subject.
Of course, as you just suggested, critics can be an important part of the construction and maintenance of a career. Mm-hmm. And of course, any professional artist is also a career artist to the extent that they're working that way. Pretty difficult to start and maintain a career What are your feelings about that? And did you have any expectations around that when you began?
My career?
Mm.
The thing I knew is that the hardest thing, well, I should say more rather, the thing I realize in hindsight is that the hardest thing to achieve is that event that hosts your work, that is the beginning. It's kind of, I usually describe it as the first big thing you get.
Mm-hmm.
The hardest thing to get is the first big thing. And then after that, the second hardest thing I consider to be is the second big thing you get. So it's kind of, with the understanding of resources in mind, it's understanding what you have within your, I suppose, portfolio, within your history, and how you work what you have achieved so far, whether you identify as a professional or not, to facilitate a momentum between one point in time and another point in time. The thing about this is, for me, I find it perplexing almost that people are able to make these points in time occur on a regular basis. I think it makes sense to me that sometimes certain absences between one work and the next work are going to be longer than what you expect, because a lot of what I do isn't so much about working in a studio, isn't so much about a routine. It's when I'm lucky enough to have an idea in my mind that I'm confident in, and then understand how to make use of the resources at my disposal to not just produce the idea, but produce the resources, like funding for the idea, to have a curator or a space feel confident in hosting that idea, and have a time frame that is realistic to make it work. There's so many things. There's so many things to consider, more than, I suppose, what I initially would have expected. But what I do value what I've learned to value out of going through this is that sometimes the space between one work and another work, whether it's long or even longer than long, is necessary for someone to experience. It can feel like being lost, and most certainly at times it could be that you are lost, and I have felt that directionless sensation of what is to happen next. But there is significance in knowing and understanding the experience of loss, and to take that even further, understanding how this directionless can fuel what you continue to do.
What are your views on the art system? And by the art system, Alex, I mean the entirety, perhaps the galleries, the curators, the critics, the international art system itself, which of course is very much involved in power and influence. From where you stand at the moment in your career, do you have any thoughts about the art system?
I know that I only know so much. And I also think that it's more than just one singular monolithic system. I'd like to think of it as less of a house and more of a circuit, or of things that connect and interconnect and that inform each other and overlap, like a web. and that I don't require the validation from an art system at large to see value in what I do and what I continue to do. But what's exciting about what I consider to be these overlapping art systems is that it presents itself a labyrinth in front of me of how to recognize the operation of things and how to use that operation to my advantage of how I can navigate through it, how I can disseminate my work through it, how people collect my work through it, whether it's through tangible item or through memory. I'd like to think my understanding of the art system is far more abstract and far more complex than what I have seen so far.
That's nice. What about current technologies, the technologies that are being developed in the last decade or so? Obviously, Facebook and the internet as a whole. Do you find that those technologies are important to your own dissemination of the practice or an understanding of what's going on in the art system as a whole?
I participate in them with aspects of my life that in some ways are connected to what I consider to be my professional practice. But I try and make that as infrequent as possible. I don't want to feel like I depend on this system because of how convenient it all is. What's funny is that we've entered a new time where a person who finds value in a cat photo and a person who finds value in their work can post both images to the same platform and probably receive a similar frequency of responses. I participate in the system to a certain degree, but it does cause me much distress. It causes me a bit of distress. It stresses me out because if I were to say have an Instagram account, which I don't have of my own, I have seen how artists operate within that terrain. And it appears as though they have a lot about themselves to post that is somehow work related. And so if we consider about what I had said about time and space and that feeling of loss, I feel like if I were to involve myself in something like Instagram where there's an expectation of regular consumption of work, I feel like that would compromise for me the thought of how images come to be within my work. I'd like to think of my work, whether it's installation or experiential or even object, which sometimes it can be, or a photograph. I'd like to think of all of these aspects of my work as a constellation, as things that are evidence of thought, evidence of experience, but also a puzzle at large that each image informs. And I don't want to compromise that as well. What I do find fascinating about Instagram that I think, or Facebook, or any of it, what I find fascinating about it is how willing people are to photograph and post your own work for you and disseminate it for you. I think there's something useful about that, especially if there's a circulation of my own work going into this system and it's not coming from myself. So that's what I think about it thus far.
Cat videos and artworks. Do you think, just to follow up on that, do you think that, Instagram especially, do you think that the very voracious quality of that system that you were just, I think, alluding to, leads to a kind of amnesia that, I think I saw that artist's work yesterday, or was it a cat video? What, do you think that there is a sense of, talking of loss, a sense of a loss of sense of continuity in terms of an artist's practice?
Well, one must be aware of the fact that the images they encounter on these platforms are not always, because some artists, I think, have figured out how to use this for their own the purposes of their own practice, where art exists within this system. But for the people who this description doesn't apply to, one must be aware of the fact that what they're looking at on the screen is not the artwork itself. It is a trace of the artwork. Do I think it cultivates an amnesia? Well, the more information there is, the less significant each individual part becomes. So perhaps there is a trace of amnesia that I associate with this experience, but what I also think about is how the more images there are, the less, when there is a substantial amount of images that grows on a daily basis, and in time loses significance because of the erosion of more images and more information. I see it more as noise instead of something precious or something that's worth giving thought or contemplation towards.
Something valuable.
Something valuable for me. People, and that's not to say that people don't get value out of Instagram or these platforms, these various platforms, because of how I talked about it being an equalizing platform as well, through its accessibility, and through that accessibility that gives you an opportunity to showcase aspects of your life. And that's sort of what galleries are too, to an extent. They just aren't as accessible, or different galleries or different spaces have different standards or preferences. So to a person who wouldn't consider themselves to have the ability to have their ideas or aspects of themselves exhibited in a physical space, to their benefit perhaps, and to their own sense of understanding their own value within themselves, this becomes something that equalizes them between whether they consider themselves an artist or a non-artist, or anything in between those two things.
Coming back to something that you raised earlier, do you equate resistance and a sense of reality, a sense of the real, a sense of what one might call authentic? Do you equate these terms, resistance and authenticity, perhaps?
I think resistance can be an aspect of authenticity. But what I think is at the crux of what I consider to be authenticity is curiosity. I think curiosity is understanding that whether an idea has been explored before or not, whether a certain process has been implemented before or not, regardless of those scenarios that you are only aware of to a certain extent, you still are interested enough in this thing, this idea, and you want to see how, through your pursuit of it, it transforms into something different. I think it is very problematic for an artist, for anyone, to make originality the priority of why they do what they do. Because like this comes into the conversation of knowing that you're an individual participating in the collective consciousness at all times, no matter what. So to pursue originality, if we want to consider it pure originality, to be on a quest to be the first person to try something so uniquely different from everything else, I think inadvertently becomes a quest to appease one's own ego.
My last question. Is it possible for a collector to collect your work?
It's not unimpossible. It depends how they value the work and what it is they value about collecting about it. Now, when we think about collection, this poses a question onto myself at the same time, which is, how do I choose to disseminate my work? Collectors come in all different kinds of forms, and to this same idea, there are an infinite amount of strategies I believe I can exercise with how my work becomes disseminated. One convention through, let's say, performance is photographs, documents. But there are other ways as well that can feel attached to the work at large and also feel obscure from it at the same time. I think whether one's collecting an object or collecting a document, whether it's something that I have my signature on or not, or if they're collecting a memory, then to me, I have done my job, because I've done something of value to somebody else that they see as valuable, whether it is an investment or something that is simply worth remembering. To distinguish a collector as something, to distinguish an ideal collector would be almost a shot in the foot on my end, actually, because I think if I were to describe that, and then a lot of people would feel alienated from not fitting into that description. And that is not why I became or choose to make art. It's not, my purpose isn't to alienate anyone. I am interested in my own ways of generating connection in the most obscure and sometimes ambiguous and in other ways, for me, clear ways. So if anyone sees what I do as something of value, then I'm happy. If I make money, though, it's a bonus.